For the next few minutes, we are going to discuss some of the historical perspectives associated with gonadal shielding when the abdomen or pelvic region of the patient is examined with radiographic X-rays. This presentation was prepared by Keith Strauss. Keith is the voice in the microphone during the presentation. Well, what is gonadal shielding? It's the placement of a flat shield, which is typically composed of some kind of lead equivalent material, on the surface of the abdomen of the patient in such a manner that a protective shadow is created over sensitive organs such as the gonads to protect from the ionizing radiation that's being emitted during the radiographic examination. This practice was discussed in the literature in a few places in 1910 to 1920, but the widespread practice of gonadal shielding did not really begin until the early 1950s. So why did it take 20 to 30 years after a known practice was recommended for it to become common? Well, it's due to Dr. Hermann Mueller, who did a number of investigations of the hereditary effects and genetic mutations that were created in Drosophila or fruit flies. He was the first person to observe gene mutations from heavy doses of X-rays given to the Drosophila in 1927. As a result of his research, he was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine 1946 for the discovery of the production of mutations by means of X-ray radiation. Well, what kind of mutations did he actually observe? Well, we know that fruit flies normally have one pair of wings, but he actually observed a number of fruit flies in the offspring of the irradiated parents that had two sets of wings as opposed to one set of wings. So we shield patients today because investigations were expanded beyond the fruit flies to a variety of other animal models, such as mice and rabbits, in an attempt to corroborate Dr. Mueller's initial efforts. The bombings at Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 at the end of World War II also created considerable public interest in the radiation effects on humans as a result of large radiation doses. By the 1950s, the results of the animal studies that were done prior to that time were extrapolated to humans, and as a result of that, patient gonadal shielding was widely adopted. So now we know a bit of the history of why in 1953 gonadal shielding became popular. Since Dr. Mueller's and other studies showed that the offspring of heavily irradiated fruit flies had an increased risk of mutations, people were concerned that radiation might create future mutations in the offspring of humans. We arrive at the time of 1976, at which time the Food and Drug Administration added a section to the Code of Federal Regulations that suggested that gonads be shielded during radiographic examinations. The only reason that was cited for this was a concern about hereditary effects. And it's important to point out that this was a recommendation. It was not a requirement in 1976. But of course, people are not fruit flies. And basically, we had decades of research that have never shown that radiation causes hereditary effects in humans. So in other words, we are most likely shielding patients to prevent a problem that did not ever exist. Continuing on our historical perspective, it's important to note that radiation doses from diagnostic X-ray examinations today in 2020 are 20 to 25 times less radiation to the gonads today than occurred in 1951. We see here that for an adult KUB, which of course is a radiograph of the abdomen, that in 1951 the entrance air kerma or exposure was 11 to 12 milligray. In 2020, that air kerma rate or dose has been decreased to a half a milligray of air kerma. For the newborn KUB, in 1951, we were at 1.4 milligray. And today, in 2020, we're at 0.07 of a milligray air kerma. The medical physicists and physicians who championed gonadal shielding in the early 1950s were really quite pleased with their new protocol because they sincerely believed that it reduced the dose to the gonads to less than 10% of the original unshielded dose. But the best information available in the mid-1950s was limited, not so much because the physicians and medical physicists were limited, but rather because the dosimetry equipment that was used to measure and estimate the dose to organs within the body was quite crude and quite limited in the 50s. Today, we have much better techniques for making these determinations, and as a result of that, this was done and published this year, and the results showed that optimum gonadal shielding reduced the dose to the testes to 15% of its original value, while reducing the dose to the ovaries to 40% of the original dose to the ovaries without shielding. The reasons why the dose savings for the ovaries is not as good as that of the testes is beyond the scope of this presentation and will be talked about in some later presentations. It's also important to understand that optimum shielding of the gonads is difficult to achieve, and some of those reasons will be discussed briefly in a few minutes. For the past 50-odd years, failure to perform gonadal shielding most likely has resulted in severe disciplinary action against technologists. I would have thought that this was changing in recent years, but I found out in 2019 when we discontinued gonadal shielding in our pediatric department that it wasn't necessarily the case. I received a call from a mother whose son had been imaged in our pediatric department, and I assumed that she was going to be concerned because her son did not receive gonadal shielding. She was concerned, but not about her son. She wanted to make sure that I understood as a medical physicist that I had a technologist within our department that was not following departmental policy because the technologist had failed to provide gonadal shielding for her son. I explained to her that we had discontinued gonadal shielding, which led to a very interesting discussion as we went forward. Most states have a regulation similar to this that came from the Ohio regulations. I use it just simply as an example. And it's a wordy regulation, and I took out the extra words, and fundamentally it says gonadal shielding shall be used for human patients during radiologic procedures in which the gonads are in the useful beam. And most people, if you ask them what gonadal shielding regulations were about, these are the things that they would describe. Now, there's other information that's not controversial at all in this statement. It says that the gonadal shielding must meet certain requirements, and it says that we're only concerned about patients who have not passed the reproductive age. Obviously, none of that's controversial, but what most people fail to understand is that this clause is also in most of the regulations from state to state, which simply says that except for cases in which this would interfere with radiologic procedure. So as a department, if you're interested in stopping gonadal shielding in your department, you simply need to have your radiologists authorize a policy within the department that states that gonadal shielding was discontinued to eliminate the possibility that the presence of the shield might compromise the examination. And if you do that, there should be no need for your department to have a written variance from their state's radiation control program. Just a couple of quick points of clarification. Suggested state regulations of the CRCPD have already been mentioned. Who is the CRCPD? Well, it's simply a conference, national conference, that provides guidance for the individual regulations that may be adopted within individual state regulatory programs. Historically, the CRCPD has included in their suggested state regulations language like we have just discussed in the state of Ohio. Gonadal shielding requirements in the SSRs, however, was completely removed during the last rewrite of the suggested state regulations. This is because individual state regulatory programs' response to changes in SSRs typically lags changes by the CRCPD by a number of years. This publication is a commentary, relatively short, that appeared in the Journal of the American College of Radiology at the latter part of 2017 that discussed the limitations of gonadal shielding. This article appeared 2 years later and expanded on some of the comments that were made in the previous document. Why is gonadal shielding less effective than once believed? Well, first, the area of the gonadal shield must be limited to prevent large areas of the patient's anatomy from being obscured in the image, which would be unacceptable to the interpreting radiologist. This limited area for the shield is not adequate to cover the entire area in which the ovaries might be located in the abdomen. Second, substantial dose to the ovaries is delivered by scatter radiation as opposed to primary radiation. The gonadal shields on the surface of the abdomen cannot attenuate scatter radiation. This explains why gonadal shielding is not as effective as for the ovaries as it is for the testes. And finally, gonadal shields may block the sensors of the automatic exposure control system, When this occurs, the dose to all the abdominal organs will be elevated. It's desirable to be able to use the AEC system as opposed to manual techniques to improve the dose to the patient, but this is impaired in many cases when gonadal shielding is also involved. I want you to be aware that new publications are on the horizon from the National Council of Radiation Protection and Measurements, or NCRP. The first is a formal statement on routine gonadal shielding of patients during abdominal and pelvic radiography. Now, we understand that discontinuing a legacy process is difficult, so as a result of that, a companion document on the aspects and recommendations to successfully discontinue gonadal shielding is also being prepared. Both of these documents should be available hopefully in the latter part of the first quarter of 2021. Here are the take-home points. First, gonadal shielding typically is less effective at reducing the dose to the gonads than once believed in the 1950s. Second, doses to the unshielded gonads are 5% of the levels used in the 1950s. Unshielded gonadal doses today are really quite small, and so gonadal shielding is not as important as it was once thought to be. Third, X-ray radiation of humans has not demonstrated the hereditary effects shown in fruit fly studies prior to 1950s. So we believe today that many of the fears in the 1950s have proven to be unfounded. And finally, in the majority of states, a site does not need a written waiver for their state's radiation control program to discontinue gonadal shielding. This is just a slide of all the references that have appeared previously in this presentation. I thank you for your attention.